hard to kind of find. It appears when it's written.
Okay, we ready? Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call to order this meeting of the Urbana City Council for Monday, September 25th, 2023. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Miss Wu? Here. Mr. Evans?
Here.
Miss Hersey?
Here.
Miss Colasetti?
Here.
Miss Bishop?
Here.
Miss Wilkin? Here. Mr. Quisenberry?
Here.
Mayor Marlin?
Here. Next item is approval of minutes from previous meetings of June 5th, 2023, which are special meeting minutes, and the June 12th, 2023 minutes. Is there a motion for approval?
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mary Alice, seconded by James. Any substantial corrections? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. Okay, that motion passes. Additions to the agenda? There are none. We'll move on to presentations and public input. We'll take public input first. Does anyone wish to address the Urbana City Council? We do have a proclamation for Pride Week, so I'd like to read this proclamation. And this is a proclamation by the mayors of the cities of Champaign and Urbana, Illinois, and the county executive of Champaign County. Whereas, in 1969, an event referred to as the Stonewall Uprising began the national movement and the modern fight for LGBTQ plus rights, which has since spread throughout the world over the past 53 years. And whereas, in 1971, a group of LGBTQ plus University of Illinois students formed the organization the Gay Liberation Front, now known as the Gender and Sexuality Resource Center. And whereas, since 1972, the cities of Champaign and Urbana have been at the forefront, both in the state of Illinois and nationwide, of protecting the rights of LGBTQ plus individuals by prohibiting the discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And whereas the cities of Champaign and Urbana and the county of Champaign have a rich and diverse history of LGBTQ plus representation in our government leaders, staff, and citizens. And whereas the Uniting Pride Up Center of Champaign County was founded in 2009 as an organization to advocate for the equality, wellness, advocacy, and visibility of the LGBTQ plus communities of all ages in Champaign County. And whereas, from September 23rd through October 1st, 2023, Champaign-Urbana's annual Pride Fest Week will host events throughout our community, offering opportunities to learn, engage, and show support for our loved ones, friends, and neighbors. And whereas the centerpiece of this 9 days of social and educational events is the community's participation in the Pride Fest and Parade in downtown Urbana on Saturday, September 30th. Now, therefore, we, Deborah Frank Finan and Diane Wolf Marlin, mayors of the cities of Champaign and Urbana, Illinois, Steve Summers, Champaign County Executive, and Kyle Patterson, Champaign County Board Chair, do hereby proclaim the week of September 23rd through October 1st, 2023 as Champaign-Urbana Pride Fest Week 2023. Thank you. And we'll move on to the presentation on the Mayor Council Strategic Goals Update. Carol.
Thank you. I'm just going to give a few highlights, and then I'd be happy to try and answer any questions that you have on the report that you were provided. So this is for the third quarter of 2023, and we have a series of strategic areas, 4 strategic areas, and then strategies within those areas, and then action steps. And so for people who aren't familiar, and then we report quarterly on those action steps. So I'm just going to call out a few. wanted to just say there were a number of things in the goals around ARPA, and all of those things are on track. The public safety review, which is under strategic area number 1, public safety and well-being, number 2A, that's on track. Our next milestone from them is a draft staffing report for the police department and the fire department, and we're expecting that before the end of November. Under the strategic area for housing, under 1C, this is supporting housing security and equity. Specifically, the action step is to coordinate with housing and social service agencies to reduce homelessness. Under that, you'll see that mention is made of a 3-year strategic plan working with the Champaign County Continuum of Service Providers to the Homeless. And I just wanted to give a little bit more detail there. That plan will be for 2023 through 2027, and there are 5 strategic areas that are being included. It's still in draft right now. So those are increased permanent housing, improved data utilization and quality, enhancing equity, improving landlord engagement, and increasing lived experience representation. That's in the strategic plan. So there will be a presentation to council by the people putting that plan together before the year is over. And the Homeless Services Summit, which is mentioned also in that item, is being held next week on October 3rd. And among the things that they will be doing is voting on this strategic plan. And they're also bringing the funders together so they can talk about funding strategies. So if you have any specific questions about that detailed-wise, Braden's more than happy to take your call. On the strategic area for infrastructure, under 1B, we have the action item was, or the area was to develop, the action item was to develop more thoughtful plans about asset management and funding strategies around different categories of assets. And so we're now done with the SWAMP, which is the Stormwater Asset Management Plan, and the recommendation that came out of that to increase the stormwater fee. And there's been work that's been done on the local motor fuel tax, and at some point we'll bring a recommendation to you on that front. And then the latest one, because I know you like the acronyms, these are from Public Works, is the LAMP, which is the Light Asset Management Plan. And so the traffic lights have been done and the street lights are being done right now. And I asked Tim for a couple of, sort of interesting things that we're going to be exploring. One is better technology, because we do not use energy saving. We do not use LED, which is very uncommon at this point. So I think you can expect to see recommendations on that front. And then the other thing is we have I think a dozen different styles of streetlights, and so that is difficult in terms of keeping up with having things in stock. So I think more uniformity. So those are just a couple of teasers for what will be in the LAMP. And then the last area is economic development and economic recovery and development. And so under 3D, this is activating downtown in anticipation of the Hotel Royer opening. And so I just wanted to share a couple of things. If you remember, a few weeks back, Stephanie McMahon came and shared some of the plans for the spring that we'll be doing to activate the lots by the library. And we also have a new restaurant map, which I will circulate that tomorrow. That's focused on downtown. It's the same thing that we use in our books for the Rantoul Sports Complex, so that people know where the restaurants are downtown. And also we have a QR code that takes them to more information if they're interested. We have a couple of new businesses that opened recently downtown. We're really excited about that. Encanto and the Gallery Art Bar, and then Strictly Wicks in the mall went from a kiosk into a regular store. And then we still have some others in the works. One of them is in the old Iron Post space, which is will be called Fernie's High Horse at some point. I know they're working on that. And then there's a speakeasy that is supposed to go into the Cohen Building. And then, of course, the Fall Fusion Festival is planned for October 7th from 4 to 8 p.m. So just some things that are helping to activate downtown. And having been downtown one evening to have dinner, It's just nice to see more people downtown, and I think we'll just keep growing from that point. So happy to answer any questions beyond the highlights that I shared.
Sharice?
When I was going over this, the one thing that I was hoping to kind of see, especially since we do so much to try to engage with Unit 116, with District 116, and help kids and stuff, and I was hoping that we could have more, I could see something, and I don't know how how we would go about it. I'm not a planning person. With the dual credit program for the fire department,
Yeah.
to try to help, kids see, and explore that area of, as far as a career. And I saw that there's just been no progress made on that, but I think that would be a good thing, if there's any way that we can work with District 116, and if there's a curriculum or something like that, figure out a way to get that underway.
That's great, and I think we're a little, we're sad that we haven't made progress on that. That was really, I think, promoted by Chief Loss when he was the chief of the fire department, and I don't know that anyone in the fire department now has experience standing up a program like that, but I know that Chief Boone does have experience with a cadet-type program, so maybe he can be a resource for us to get that started up.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Grace?
Thank you. Thanks for the updates on these. There's a lot of great progress to see in them. Trying to condense my thoughts. I will have questions, comments on just 3 items. I've narrowed it down to. So I saw that there's a human rights specialist recently hired, and I think that's great. I just didn't recall this coming up in things. I guess this was part of budget conversations of a new position.
This is
To refresh our memory on this.
Yeah, sure. Well, this is a rework of what was the community outreach coordinator. And what, in reviewing the work of the office and also making the change to have the position of working with the students. Remember, we had Self-Made Kings, and that was being staffed by one of our city staff person. And instead, through the ARPA funding, and with the cooperation of the school district, we thought that's actually better to be an employee of the school district. So then we wanted to revamp that position to really give more, I would say, focus in the office on human rights as opposed to community engagement broadly. So, and Carla has been doing this all by herself up to this point. So this person was just brought on full-time, I would say, maybe within the last month, I think. So it has expanded the capacity of the office to pursue some of the things that council's been interested in.
That's great to hear. Thank you. Okay. The other one was about the bag fee. It says here that staff developed an estimate about time implementation. Last I recall, it wasn't really laid out as far as time. It was like, well, it was a give or take. If we did that, then Scott would have to stop doing these things.
Right.
I didn't recall an update that we got from council that was really quantitative about the staff time required.
Okay, that's what I had intended to capture in the words that I used. Can you tell me which number that is by any chance? And then I can look at what I wrote.
63 of the whole thing. It is Strategic Area 3, Strategy 3, Action C.
Thank you.
So by that, you were encompassing the description of our previous conversation.
Yes, basically the trade-off.
Yeah, I still feel like I would appreciate an amount of time, as in like X hours a week, or, X full-time equivalent in a year or something.
Would you say that again? I'm not sure I follow what you said.
As a quantitative unit of staff time, I would appreciate that. Like X number of hours per week is what would be required, or this percentage of a full-time equivalent for this amount of time. I feel like when we got before, it was just like, Scott could maybe do it, but then he'd have to stop doing SAC meetings or geothermal, and it wasn't really time, because for me, that's not the decision I want to make. I want to make the decision of, okay, do we hire a part-time person, or where can we get 10 hours a week of work on this?
Okay.
You. And then my last one was about the properties. This was goal 4.1C, identify downtown sites for 50 units of market rate housing.
Yes.
And so for this one, this is what I said in the 2x2 that I was able to attend and fortunately make up with this one. That I think this needs to be a public discussion still. This is, I think, another example to me that feels like taking the 2x2s as an approval method ahead of time and not publicly. What I said in those meetings is that I think this needs to be a public decision still, because the last time that we publicly talked about this, similar to some other past situations, we very clearly said that we would still decide how these properties would be used publicly as council. And so I just get red flags going up when we say they're going to be used for market rate housing in the goal, when we haven't publicly decided that by a majority of the legislative body who would decide that.
I understand why you would feel that way. I'll tell you what our plan is, given the concerns that you raised, was to draft the RFP and share it with council, not for your approval per se, but for any recommendations that you'd like to make to revise language, because we talked about preferences, and when we were speaking with you, it was a question of, did you want to make decisions, prior to receiving proposals or based on proposals? So I think we want to craft some language and then get some feedback from council about whether you think, and when I say that, whether the majority of council thinks that we're emphasizing the right things, whether we're foreclosing something that we shouldn't foreclose, or whether we should be foreclosing something that we're not foreclosing. And then, once we get all the feedback about what the RFP itself says, which we'd like to be encouraging things to move in a particular direction, but maybe not requiring that it move in a particular direction, and then see what the market tells us. Because I think that's the most important message that we wanted to get. So the council would have input at the front end before we issue the RFP, and then the council will certainly have input at the back end after we receive proposals.
Thank you. And I don't know if possible, I would appreciate if we could clarify that in the update, just that, it's that you have overall support from council, seems like, for the whole issue rather than for the RFP specifically, if that's what you're specifically referring to.
Okay.
I think this could be interpreted as approving the whole use of these sites for market rate housing, the way that it's listed here. And I think it would be helpful to clarify some of that you're moving with the RFP at this point only.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Chris?
Thank you. Okay, Carol, so strategy area number 4, strategy support current local businesses, action step D, enhance CDAP to include more Urbana minority-owned businesses and all that.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm looking at the last entry, are planning a doing business with Urbana event.
Yes.
And I'm just curious when that is or where it is. That might not be scheduled, but
I will find out whether it has been scheduled yet.
okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Any other questions? Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.
Oh, anyone attending remotely have questions? Sounds like no. Okay, thank you. We'll move on to council input and communications.
On behalf of the Committee of the Whole, on the consent agenda, there are two items. Ordinance number 2023-09033, ordinance approving a final subdivision plat for Fieldstone Subdivision Number 1, Plan Case 2478S23. And ordinance number 2023-09034, an ordinance amending the Urbana zoning map, 601 Killarney Street, Plan Case 2477M23.
Second.
I'm sorry, point of order, I would like to divide the question. I didn't realize that the subdivision plat was on consent agenda. I'd like to remove that one from the consent agenda.
There's been a request to remove ordinance 2023-09-033 to the regular agenda. That leaves the ordinance 2023-09-034 on the consent agenda.
And I'll update my second to the
Sure.
revised consent agenda.
All right, it's been moved by Mary Alice, seconded by James. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Wu,
Yes.
Mr. Evans,
Yes.
Ms. Hersey,
Yes.
Ms. Colacetti,
Yes.
Ms. Bishop,
Yes.
Ms. Wilkin,
Yes.
Mr. Quisenberry.
Yes.
That motion passes. We'll move on to the regular agenda.
Shall I say the ordinance that I already did since it's on the regular agenda? All right. On behalf of the committee, I move approval of ordinance number 2023-09033, an ordinance approving a final subdivision plat at Fieldstone Subdivision Number 1, Plan Case 2478S23.
There's a second.
Second.
Moved by Mary Alice, seconded by James. Any discussion? Grace?
I didn't know if staff wanted to lead with any input about covenants and HOA agreements, or if I should go into reiterating some of my questions and concerns.
We received your questions by email. I think Dave is prepared to respond.
Well, and I guess I'll comment from, I think, what was the suggestions or concerns from the last meeting, and I guess if beyond that there are additional, certainly we can kind of have the discussion, and I'll provide the answers to that. As I recall from last week, it was more around whether or not an HOA would be exempt from the city's human rights ordinance, and the answer to that is no, they're not exempt. HOAs are generally kind of held to be, or are like non-for-profit entities, standalone entities, and so as such, they would, like any other entity, be subject to the city's HRO. So if there's anything beyond that, I can answer it. Do you want me to address the email that you sent out with the example on the solar issue, or no? Okay. Just for the council's perspective, did you send it to the entire council or just to a couple of us? Okay. Councilmember Wilkin had sent out a link to a state statute that talked about the idea of solar energy, and what it indicated was that there's a restriction on homeowners associations' ability to prohibit solar on property within an HOA. And so I guess if I'm misunderstanding, certainly correct me. I took that to be like an example of there are laws that may affect HOAs, and how does that kind of play into the idea of what we're talking about for the approval of the plat. And it's somewhat driven by the idea of, I think, the concern over the comments about that HOAs are kind of a private issue. And I think that comment was driven not so much to say they're exempt from city ordinances, but there are a lot of things that are internal to the homeowners association, the property owners within that area encompassed by the HOA. This would be one of them. So let's assume for the moment, it's not true, but let's assume for the moment that this particular HOA has a restriction saying we're not going to allow solar, period, on properties within or encompassed by the HOA. So here we've got a statute that says, no, they can't do that. It's not the city's role to go to that HOA and say, hey, you're violating the state statute, you need to remove that restriction. That's an issue between the property owners and the HOA. Me as a property, if I'm a property owner and now I find out that there's a state statute that actually would allow me to have solar if I chose to do so, even in light of the HOA's restrictive covenant, then I can go at the HOA to say, you need to remove it because the statute exists. Or if they don't do that, it's incumbent upon me as property owner to sue them in court to say, court, I want you to tell them to remove that restriction. So it's, those kinds of things are outside the purview of the city. If there's some violation of the city ordinance, certainly we take that up ourselves. But like I said, there's some things that are clearly driven to just the internal operations of the HOA and the property owners themselves.
And just for the record, council members did receive a copy of the homeowners association agreement. Thank you for sending that. Mary Alice.
So Dave, I'm wondering if it's kind of similar to a lease in that a landlord can write a lease and there are certain rules at the state and also at the local level that they can't overwrite, so to speak. So it sounds to me like it's similar with the HOA.
Right, yes, that's a good analogy, I think, on the idea is that if there are things that are affecting what the landlord actually put in place, I think you can address those things, not necessarily you can say you can't do that completely. It's that depending on what action is taken and how it interplays with what the law is, that's where we may come into play at the end.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Chris?
Dave, so the scenario you just gave, it made it sound like it's up to the property owners to enforce the state law in civil court. Did I hear that kind of right, or?
For that particular issue, again, is in reference to the idea, the statutory indication that homeowner associations cannot restrict having solar on the property.
Right.
It's, the HOA can try and enforce their covenants that they have in place against the owners of the property in there. If the property owners themselves see something that is beyond the authority of the HOA to do, it's the property owner's responsibility to go to the HOA and deal with that issue. Now, again, that's separate from the idea of what I said before, is if there's a violation of the city ordinance, certainly we kind of take that on. But there are certain situations that it's really not in our purview to act on.
Okay, that was my follow-up question. So as a city, we would enforce our ordinances when there's a violation,
Right,
correct?
correct,
Oh, okay,
yes.
thank you.
Any other questions? Grace?
Thanks. Thanks for clarifying some of this, because, yeah, it didn't sit well with me last week saying that it's a private matter, which I understand to an extent. Like you said, with a lease, it depends on your specific agreement with a landlord and a tenant, but that there are very serious things that cannot, and certain things that cannot be in a lease and certain things that have to be in a lease. And so I just wanted to clarify that same process here. I think it can be misinterpreted to say that it's just a private matter and the city and the state laws don't have a place in it, and that that's not correct. So as far as the solar ones, and just so you all know, and that might be another fun thing to tackle, is with the Illinois state law, that the way I'm reading it is that HOAs, covenants, or agreements can't restrict solar panels. And so the example here is saying that they need to be attached on a roof and not an accessory structure. I'm not a legal expert on this. You have to, everyone find their own, but the way I'm reading it, I don't think that that flies. And so what I'm hearing is it sounds like it's up to the residents to kind of report and enforce those things with the proper legal body who has the regulation. And is there any assistance in Urbana? Like, does our Human Rights and Equity Office can help navigate anyone with those kinds of things to know if it is a city or a state issue and where to go from there, if there were potential issues?
I guess only comment on what I understand the HREO office to handle it. I'm not sure that would be something that's in their purview unless Carol suggests otherwise on the idea of what we're talking about here as far as, the city somehow kind of being within the process of a regulation like this as it pertains to the HOA. To help navigate. I don't know that that's within their purview either. I mean, I understand the HREO is more driven to the idea of violations of our human rights ordinance, to that degree, not so much something like this.
Oh, yeah, I mean, just in the bigger picture, whether it's outside of solar panels, if it's discrimination for source of income or for renters or student status, I'm talking about if someone's not
Yes.
sure, it seems like when you put the onus on the average resident, and then it's like, well, how are they supposed to know and figure all this out? So I guess I'm just asking if there is any resources locally to help people navigate that. And I think it would be great in an ideal world if we could even be more proactive, like we've talked about with rental agreements and seeking out or testing and seeing if there's just open discrimination and being proactive about it rather than putting the burden on the residents. And this is outside of this particular issue. I'll clarify that too. I appreciate that this covenant had no other equity red flags, and I wanted to have the record publicly clarified about how the city is involved or is not involved in HOA agreements.
Just to clarify, HOAs are subject and must comply with the city's human rights ordinance. I rewatched the video from last week. The comment about it being a private issue, the one I heard was in response to whether or not the Fieldstone Development was obligated to join the HOA. And the answer there is no, they're not obligated to join. And that was, the answer was it's an issue between the developer and the HOA. I didn't hear any other reference to it being a private issue for human rights violations. But nonetheless, the city's human rights ordinance applies to HOAs in Urbana. Any other questions? James?
I'm just going to say that I'm going to vote for this because what we're considering here is the platting of a subdivision. Discussion about the possibility of whether that subdivision joins an HOA or not is not relevant to the business in front of the city. I understand the concerns. It sounds like a very good thing to be dug into from a standpoint, but it's not relevant to the piece of action at hand. Whether it's, we are not voting on whether this group joins an HOA or not. We're just voting on whether it becomes a subdivision or not. That's not our purview right now, and probably would not be the question of an HOA. Now, if there's an HOA out there that is doing something that is against state law or Urbana ordinance, they should be aware that if they're in violation, they can be challenged, and they should be. But it's not relevant to this piece of legislation, so I'm going to vote for it.
Any new topics? Grace?
I also plan to vote for this. In my opinion, I think that equity is always in my purview for an issue. I understand that's not the specific one, and I really appreciate the applicant sharing us, which may or may not be the one that you go with. So I understand that, and I will always think that it's important to bring up equity and bring up issues like this, especially when I have red flags going off, like hearing that there's a housing covenant in one of our most affluent neighborhoods. I think that's huge. And my stance is that that's always going to be important for me in every issue, and I still support this one. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, will the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Wu,
Yes.
Mr. Evans,
Yes.
Ms. Hersey,
Yes.
Ms. Colasetti,
Yes.
Ms. Bishop,
Yes.
Ms. Wilkin,
Yes.
Mr. Quisenberry.
Yes.
That motion passes.
On the regular agenda tonight, we have ordinance number 2023-09035, an ordinance revising the annual budget ordinance for budget amendment number 2, DCEO grant. On behalf of the committee of the whole, I move approval.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved by Mary Alice, second by Sharice. Just for the record, I want to let the public know that a copy of the agreement with DCEO was provided to the City Council. Any discussion? Grace?
I won't hash out the whole thing, but just state for this meeting that I stated a lot of my points in opposition to this last week, and think that we could use this money for direct services that would improve the lives of some residents in a more direct way. While I do think fire stations are important, I think that this is not going to change their construction, it's not going to enhance them, and that we're losing opportunity costs for other funds from this grant.
Any other comments? Sharice?
I just want to state something right from the contract. Community development, capital improvement projects. Capital improvement projects will be completed in low-income target neighborhoods. Grant funds will be used to cover financial gaps in the construction of 2 new fire stations and will include the purchase of property at 1205 West Bradley Avenue in Urbana, Illinois, and design engineering costs. Funds will leverage local capital improvement funds for a total budget of $10,700,000. So when we applied for this money, that was included in the application. The grant was approved based on that. And they kind of let you know that if you don't use the money for what you said you're going to use the money for, they can take it back. We have to give it back. Payments to the grantee are subject to the grantee's submission and certification of eligible costs, and any documentation is required by the grantor. Payment should be initiated upon the grantor's approval of eligible costs and cash amount requested for reimbursement of those costs. And they kind of let you know if you're not using, that the grantor actually keeps tabs on this, and if you're not using the money, or if the money is not used quick enough, the grantor reserves the right to deny any voucher request at its discretion based on the lack of progress toward meeting completion goals. If the grantee fails to meet any of the performance measures, goals, and if deemed appropriate at the discretion of the grantor, grant funds may be decreased by an amount proportionate to the size of the shortfall, and/or the grantee may be responsible for the return of the grant funds in the amount specified by the grantor. Grantor may initiate a grant modifications to deobligate grant funds based on non-performance. Grantee will submit grant modification requests as necessary in a timely manner, including a request to deobligate grant funds in an amount that the grantee determines will be unspent by the end of the grant agreement term. So it's been made pretty plain from what I'm reading, at least, that since we put that in the application, they're expecting us to spend the money with that. And I don't know, I'm not a grant writer, and I'm not a contractor or anything like that, but my understanding is that they've specified that monies would be used for this. And so I think that, any question about how else it could be used is a kind of void on some level, because it seems like we have to use it for what we said that we were going to use it for.
Okay, thank you. Any other? James?
Yeah, I will reiterate my comments from the Committee of the Whole. I intend to support this, although I don't believe it's absolutely necessary for this grant money to be spent on the fire stations. I am in complete support of rebuilding these fire stations. I've been there, I've looked at them. I believe it is investment in our infrastructure in two neighborhoods that need infrastructure. It is consistent with the DCEO grant that it is under. So we're not doing anything that's outside of what it was intended to be for. One of the things I do want to reiterate is that ARPA funds were not allowed to be spent on things like this. And so we targeted ARPA funds for many things in this area that would be necessary and needed and to move forward with. But this was an opportunity to build these buildings with support from the state, and I think that's appropriate, and I'm going to support it. Thank you.
Any other comments? Anyone who hasn't spoken yet? I'm going to give everybody a chance.
I'd like to make a comment and
Yes,
actually
go ahead,
have
Jan.
a question. Thank you. And I apologize if I missed this from last week. Can I get clarification on why the specific use was not specified when this was brought before council last year in September?
I want to just go back to, yes, I'm going to answer that, Jaya. I just wanted to make reference to the information that we had in last week's council packet, which kind of traced over the different milestone dates in this, as this grant came forward. And so we let me make sure I don't misspeak, so let me get it in front of me. So in September of 2022, that was when the DCEO grant was accepted by the council, and it was in the broad categories that were put in front of the council at that point in time, and the $1.5 million was included for community development capital improvement projects. That's what it, that's,
Yeah,
that's what we
Carol,
had.
I see that, and I think that's where my question is coming in. I'm sorry, it's a little difficult with the remote option, because the grant specifies that it might be used for the fire stations. Is that, when was the grant written compared to when?
Right,
The
that-
grant would have been written prior to that presentation, isn't that correct?
No, that's why I went back to that point. So.
I see. Okay, so go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So at that point, it was still this sort of general category of capital development, community development, capital improvement projects. And then in March, we had 2x2s with council, and we were checking in before we incorporated the funding, the use of that funding for fire stations. That's when we had the check-in with council, and we said we thought this was the best use of the money given the time frame, and that council had expressed a desire for us to seek grant money as a primary source of funding for the fire stations. So a couple things happened as a result of those 2x2s where we got direction, and one of those things is that we put the that grant funding, we allocated that to the fire stations in the CIP. But another thing that we did was that was the point at which this grant agreement, not the application, was being written. And so we wrote into the grant agreement the specific language that Sharice read earlier. So that's how those things kind of dovetailed together. We didn't have that level of detail in September.
That's very helpful. I
Okay.
really appreciate that.
Okay.
And I will say, because I really was, and I apologize, attending remotely, the video lag, so I do apologize if I speak over anybody. I'm definitely in favor of the city seeking grant funding. This is a vital service that we need, and while making sure that we have funding for other needs in our community is essential, I also think it's important that we don't take the fact that we're talking about taking on debt, right, and form bonds lightly. Our obligation to our residents also includes good fiscal stewardship. And I was certainly among, I think all of us recommended applying for grants to help fund this project. So I think clarifying that timeline, because certainly watching that video, it is not specified, and seeing the grant agreement and getting that clarification that was subsequent to that is very helpful. Because I do think this is a much needed resource in our community. So thank you for that clarification.
Thank you. Any other, Chandra, did you have any comments?
No, I don't. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. Grace.
Thank you. So let's clarify for me, this issue is not about rebuilding the fire stations, and that hasn't been an issue. That's something we are going to do and committed to do regardless. I think what Sharice was reading, I think could have been confusing to some, because I think what Carol was clarifying, that was from the grant agreement from June of this year, not from September of last year. So I didn't see the application as far as I know, but I imagine that fire stations weren't on the application. Fire stations were not mentioned in our approval or acceptance of this grant in September of 2022. Because of private 2x2 meetings with council, staff got the direction to go this way, and it was approved in the capital improvement plan. I agree with that completely. That was my personal bad, not noticing it in there and making a point about it then. But I just wanted to clarify that that's not the case, that this grant was always intended and applied for and accepted for fire station construction. This was something recent that was just drafted in June of this year. And I plan to vote no for it for reasons already stated. Thank you.
Okay. Mary Alice? No? Chris? And I think then we probably discussed this enough. Go ahead.
So I do think that we would easily spend this money quickly if we were to use it for the appropriate uses that a DCEO grant is for. When you consider all the needs in the community, it would go very fast. So we have no problems with spending it. Again, I just think that the spirit of a DCEO grant was intended for the economic opportunities in these low-income neighborhoods and not for the government buildings of these neighborhoods. So I will be voting no against this.
All right. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Wu,
Yes.
Mr. Evans,
No.
Ms. Hersey,
Yes.
Ms. Colacetti,
Yes.
Ms. Bishop,
Yes.
Ms. Wilkin,
No.
Mr. Quisenberry.
Yes.
The
Mayor Marlin?
Mayor Marlin?
Mayor Marlin.
Yes. This takes 6 of 8, and this motion passes. Thank you, Mary Alice. Reports of special committees, we have none. Reports of officers.
I have a couple of things to share tonight. One is an update on DART and the closure of DART. Just wanted to share a couple things. There were 138 employees in the Urbana location at the time the closure was announced. And with the help of EDC, we have been informed that 40% of those people have Urbana addresses. So they're maybe not all in the city of Urbana, but you know they're at least some of those people are. And so we got an update this morning on what EDC is doing to assist in getting these folks reemployed. And this is, the EDC has been terrific on this. They have a really good cooperative relationship with DART, helping with outplacement. So they organized on-site job fair. And DART's been great about letting people go to the job fair on their work, during their work hours and so on. And then EDC brought, I forget what the number is, of employers in, and they specified that they're focused on Champaign County employers, people who are hiring now, not in the future, so that they can put these people to work. So they had a good first round. They're going to, I know there are interviews taking place, and then they're gonna see and try to target for another one after they see how successful this one was and who was able to get employment and who was not. It was interesting to learn that DART is actually pays a better wage than some of the other employers in the area. So they've been good to their employees, and so they had a lot of longstanding employees. People are getting severance agreements. So I think, the feeling that we got is this is being handled as well as one can handle a closure like this. And there's no update on what's happening with the property itself. But if anybody has any questions about that, I had one other item.
James?
Yeah, I do have a question. Thank you for that update. It's hard to call it doing well by employees when a whole location is shut down, but I understand what your point was there. I have gotten a number of inquiries, both by phone and by email, from concerned citizens that are worried that the property might become blighted if there isn't a transition to a future use, and that it may be difficult for the city to act on that if it gets sold and its ownership moved around. And so I'd like to know that as staff, we're looking at how we prevent it becoming an unused factory for the long term.
Well, we have whatever tools that are available to us for any kind of blighted property, but what the feedback we're getting so far is that this is a property that people are interested in. So I think just from that alone, I think that we have a high degree of confidence that this property is not going to lie fallow. So the other item that I wanted to mention, which I found myself doing a little bit of a deep dive on after we got the word. So the first African American Heritage Trail sign in Urbana is going to go up this week, and it's going to go up outside the courthouse, and the topic is African Americans in the Civil War. And so there, you can go on to the African American Heritage Trail site, and you can get a little bit of history, or you can get a lot of history. So I'm going to just take a second and share with you that in 1864, in April, there was the 29th United States Colored Troops was formed, and that was the first unit of black African American troops that was raised in Illinois, and that was after the Emancipation Proclamation. So that's April of 1864, and that included 9 men from Champaign County, and people and others enlisted in other regiments, but at least 9 in that particular one. And then this particular regiment was then deployed in June of 1864. They started in April. In June, they participated in a battle that was part of the Siege of Petersburg that most people don't know. And if anybody here knows, I'll be really impressed. It's called the Battle of the Crater. Anybody hear of the Battle of the Crater? Okay, that's what you're supposed to go Wikipedia that tonight. It's very interesting, and the crater is still there if you go to Petersburg, Virginia, and in the historic park there. And the story of how these troops participated in that, I think, is fascinating. So, we got the word about the sign, and then there's just so much history to learn as a result of that. So look for that when the week is over.
And
Thank
that is the reason for this trail.
Yes.
So one last item to announce is the Pride Fest, of course, and the highlight of that, the culmination of that will be the Pride Parade and Pride Fest in Urbana on Saturday. We invite council members, if you haven't signed up officially, to walk with the city in the parade. We're unit number 4 in the parade. We'll meet at the corner of Illinois and Lincoln. Step off is at 2:30 on Saturday. If you come early, you can help finish decorating the vehicle, but there will be a vehicle and then people walking. So we hope you can join us then. Thank you. And with no further business before the council, step off is at 2:30, Illinois and Lincoln, unit number 4. You can be there at 1, you could be there at 1:30 or 2, yes. Thank you. This meeting is adjourned.